I never wanted to be a police officer. At least not in the way some of my colleagues did when they droned on about how they always wanted to be in the police force even as little kids. How they were always dressed in their precious little policeman costume every Halloween and did push-ups in their room at night and went on ride-alongs after they graduated high school. All I actually heard was they were colossal kiss-asses that relished even an iota of authority over others, either real or imagined. Don't get me wrong, I did actually want to be a police officer, and I did feel like I was doing something important. I think that's what made me get out of bed in the morning. But it was also just a job with a decent salary and a good pension, not some sort of phony higher calling. And I knew that I would have to put up with some bullshit, especially at the beginning. The washout rate of new hires was roughly 50%, so I fully braced myself for all the shit that was expected to come my way. Sorry, I'm probably being a little bit melodramatic. I might be a little jaded after everything I've seen in the past 25 years with the state police. In 1994, I finished the Louisiana State Police Academy and was given my first posting, a patrol assignment during the graveyard shift of 11 p.m. to 8 a.m. Not uncommon for a rookie assignment. My patrol zone was called Le Bayous, which was actually 3 adjoining bayou parishes all situated along the southwest corner of the coast. Le Bayous had a few working-class towns along the one highway that connected them all, but was ultimately a poor and neglected part of the state. Between the small port towns, Le Bayous was mostly empty. No movie theaters, no sit-down restaurants, and definitely no available women. I wondered why anyone even bothered to live here, as there were surely better opportunities back towards New Orleans. Admittedly, everything about these bayous that I was assigned to put me on edge. There was just something that I couldn't put my finger on. Maybe it was just the general atmosphere of the place. There were the long, unpaved roads, the dim lights of the oil tankers in the distance, the old, weathered stone forts covered by vines and nearly forgotten by time. I got a cold chill down my spine every time I heard the Gulf wind softly whistling through the trees. I think the worst part of Le Bayous was that you never got the feeling that you were alone. When I would drive between the little towns, the trees seemingly enclosing me, it always felt like there was some dreadful presence out there, barely hidden from view. Just waiting, watching. It would have been nice to have a partner to distract me, or even know that there would be backup if it was needed, but the state was not known for their fiscal abilities, especially not in those days. I guess I should have just been grateful for a patrol car and fuel to put in it. I did have a little company occasionally. A radio dispatch officer was stationed about 50 miles away and handled 911 calls for my section of the state, sending myself and other officers out to wherever we were needed in our respective patrol zones. Other than that, I had little human contact during my shifts. I was called to break up the occasional bar fight or help someone chop their car's battery down at the steel mill, the area's largest employer. Most of my nights I spent cruising on the winding dirt roads along the coast, assuming the local fishermen may have some petty grievances that I would need to sort out. But I always did my job like I was supposed to. I didn't slack off or shirk my responsibilities just because I didn't like my bosses, Le Bayous or the fucking bayou. I showed up on time, responded to calls and wrote my reports, all by the books. And if the place made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, it didn't matter. I would get a promotion after a year or so and move on to better assignments. All I had to do was swallow my discomfort and pay my dues. One night I was sitting in my patrol car trying to finish an accident report. I had parked off the side of the little dirt road that ran parallel to the coast and connected 2 small towns. I had picked this place to stop because it was right in front of an old church that I was convinced was abandoned, even if the sign out front was updated every Sunday. It was the only place on this road that wasn't surrounded by trees on either side, and I did not enjoy feeling claustrophobic out here in the dark. The rain was pouring so loudly outside that I could no longer hear the chitter of insects outside. I looked down at my report, which I was struggling with. An old man had called the police to report that his daughter was missing, only for me to find out that the old man didn't remember her name, what year it was, or the fact that the daughter had moved out 20 years ago. I don't know why I even bothered. Absolutely no one was ever going to read this. As I watched rain droplets race down my windshield, I pulled a cigarette out and lit it up. The clock on my radio said 1:47 in the morning. I allowed myself to take pity on myself for a minute. Surely I wasn't going to get promoted for my thorough reports on poor old men with dementia. I rolled down my window enough to flick my cigarette butt out into the road and put it up quickly to keep the rain out. As I was about to take up my incident report again, the police radio lit up, illuminating my patrol car with its soft amber lights, and let out a series of crackles. I grabbed the handheld responder, waiting to hear from dispatch. The radio crackled again, this time followed by static. After waiting 10 or so seconds, I finally mashed the button on my responder, worried I was missing something important from the head office. Dispatch, this is Patrol 57. I missed your last message. Please repeat. Over. After a few seconds, the radio lit up again. Patrol 57, this is dispatch. No message for you at this time. Over. I put my responder down and studied my radio for a second. Maybe it was just some local interference from an AM tower or a trucker and his shortwave radio passing by on the highway about 15 miles north. The radio lit up again, this time going directly to static. I focused intently, trying to make out any words I might hear. The static continued, but a background whine was present as well. Its pitch went higher and lower, almost rhythmically it seemed. I moved my head closer to the radio. Listening as closely as I could, I swear that I heard a voice through the static, spoken as a whisper. Help me. And then all noise from the radio stopped, leaving me in darkness. As I reached up to turn on the overhead light, I could feel my mind churning at 1,000,000 miles an hour. I took in a big gulp of air and let it out slowly, then grabbed the radio's responder. Dispatch, Patrol 57 again. Please confirm again that no message has been sent. Over. The radio jumped back to life once more. Patrol 57, confirming no messages, likely just interference. Please keep this channel clear, officer. Over. I could tell that there was an air of annoyance in the dispatcher's voice. I might have been a little irritated as well if I were in their shoes. I sighed and put the radio's responder back on its hook. I sat for a minute in the darkness, wondering what I should do next. On one hand, I knew the dispatch was probably right about the message just being interference. Also, I might not have even heard anyone speaking. It could have just been my brain trying to find something human in the overwhelming static. Almost like how you always seem to find faces and bodies in random patterns. On the other hand, I knew I should investigate, just in case someone actually did need help. I shuddered at the thought of what horrid situation someone must be in if they're whispering for help on a shortwave radio at 2 in the morning. There was only one place they could be, the church. When I stepped out of my patrol car onto the dirt road, I was soaked within seconds. I pulled my head down tightly over my forehead, trying to keep the rain out of my eyes. Then I grabbed the heavy flashlight off my belt and twisted it on, throwing light on the wooden sign in front of the small, ramshackle church. Underneath the church's name was a Bible quote, "Rejoice, for he is always present." Unsurprisingly, it wasn't nearly as reassuring as one would hope as I stood in the rain, preparing myself to walk up to the church. There was a narrow drive that led up the side of the property to the church. It must have only been 60 or 70 feet, but in that moment it might as well have been a mile. To the left of the drive was the church's front lawn, the grass tall and overgrown with weeds. To the right, however, was the edge of the bayou forest. The trees and brush were so thick that you could never see more than a few feet in, even in daytime. I don't know what worried me more, the impenetrable jungle or the decrepit church. I slowly walked up the small drive, the mud squelching beneath my feet. I kept my light pointed into the trees lining the right-hand side of the drive, occasionally looking over my shoulder in case the rain drowned out the sound of something behind me. As I looked forward again, something in the trees caught my eyes. When I turned and pointed my flashlight into the brush, a shining pair of eyes were staring back at me. I didn't even get a good look before the eyes disappeared in a flurry of movement, concealed by the thick underbrush. I stood and stared into the jungle for a moment before I realized I was holding my breath. I forced myself to slowly exhale and try to breathe regularly. I shouldn't be this tense. I was a police officer, god damn it. What are you gonna do next time? Shoot at a raccoon in someone's garbage? Fucking coward. I kicked myself mentally, then forced myself to quickly power myself up the remainder of the drive and onto the steps of the church. I reached the landing in front of the church doors and knocked. "Police!" I yelled. "Is anyone here?" I held my ear to the door, but didn't hear any movement. I waited for 30 seconds and knocked again. Nothing. I stepped over to the corner of the landing to a small window and peered in. I had to cup my hands around my face to block out the glare of the moonlight. I could see a relatively small room filled with a dozen or so wooden pews and an altar at the back. Behind the altar was an impressively large crucifix with a ceramic figure of Jesus attached to it. Even with almost no light, I could see the pained expression on his face. Enough of this, I thought. If there's someone here, they've had ample warning. I grabbed the doorknob and gave it a try. Surprisingly, it turned. The door was unlocked. I gave the door a slight push and stepped back as it swung open with a soft groan. I pointed the flashlight into the meager room, dutifully examining every corner before I entered. I took a few steps in and yelled again, "Police! Is there anyone here?" When no one answered, I went down the aisle between the 2 rows of pews. I could see a thin layer of dust on each of the wooden benches. I got the impression that this church hasn't had any congregants in a while. As I walked, it felt like the ceramic figure's eyes were following me, no matter where I stepped. Even when I looked down at each pew, I could feel the eyes in the side of my head, and I would quickly turn back to face the altar. I found the doorway to my left when I finally made it up to the altar. The door was open and I pointed my light into the dark room. There was a small kitchen, with old appliances lining the far wall, a sink on one end, and a round wooden table with 4 chairs. I found the light switch on the wall when I walked into the kitchen. The room began to softly hum as the fluorescent lights above the kitchen table came on. I'm not sure why I didn't look for a switch in the main room when I first entered the church. Maybe the building looked so old to me that I just assumed it didn't have any electricity. That's ridiculous, I thought. Even the poorest areas of Le Bouteille at least have electricity or running water, regardless of how low my opinion of it was. Standing in the entrance to the kitchen, there was one door to my right, along with a window next to it overlooking what I assumed was the backside of the church building. When I stepped over to the window and peered out, I shuddered. It was the church's cemetery, filled with tall, granite headstones, most of them covered with black mildew from decades of rain and neglect. Behind the headstones was a forest of reeds. I realized that it must be a marsh or some sort of tidal area. These weren't uncommon on the coast, obviously, and I imagined all of the local wildlife hiding just a few steps into the marsh, waiting for their next meal. In the other corner of the room, towards the front of the church, was yet another door. If there was anyone here, this was the only other place they could be. Having a bit more courage with the light on, I marched towards the door and quickly flung it open. The brightness of the kitchen contrasted with the darkness of this new room made me stop for a few seconds and let my eyes readjust. When I could finally see clearly again, I found myself looking into a bedroom that appeared to be mostly empty. I saw a small television in front of me, sitting on top of weathered grey carpet. In the corner was a short wooden dresser with what appeared to be an old radio on top. And then I noticed the twin bed in the far corner. I stopped still. There was someone in the bed. I could see what I assumed was the back of an old man's head, based on the short white hair. In the narrow corridor of light coming from the kitchen, I tiptoed towards the bed. It felt like an eternity to cover the few steps to the old man, but when I finally made it, I gently laid my hand on his shoulder. I didn't even try to shake the old man awake. He was so stiff and so cold that even I, inexperienced as I was, knew he was dead. Radio dispatch told me it would be several hours before a coroner would arrive to pronounce the old priest dead and fill out the relevant paperwork. Until then, I was to stay put and keep the area secure. Fortunately, no one was around to see me roll my eyes at this command. I decided to sit at the church's small kitchen table to do my paperwork, with the bedroom's door firmly shut. I didn't like my directions to secure the scene, whatever that meant, but I didn't feel like waiting in my patrol car was technically what I was supposed to be doing. It was probably safer to hang out inside and keep an eye on things. Besides, after the whispered message on the radio, I oddly felt safer in the outdated kitchen than I did outside in my dimly lit squad car in the middle of nowhere. But this did raise an important question to me. Was the message that I heard real? I mean, it did lead me to finding the old man. Or was it simply a coincidence? Most priests that I had encountered here in the bayous were fairly old, so this scenario didn't seem particularly unlikely. But if it was real, how did it get sent? Did the priest contact me beyond the grave? Why would he need help? Unfortunately, I didn't have time to dwell on it. I could hear a soft buzz coming from the bedroom. I sat in silence for a moment, unsure of what was happening. Hesitantly, I stood up and went over to the bedroom door as the buzzing grew louder. I slowly turned the knob and pushed the door open, keeping one hand on the wall inside the kitchen. Then I knew exactly what the noise was. Atop the wooden dresser in the corner, the radio was on and emitting the same static that I had heard in my patrol car earlier. I don't know if I stayed in the doorway because I was so terrified that my legs refused to work or because I was simply dumbfounded. Either way, I stood in place, transfixed on the radio. The radio did the same pattern as before, static with a background wire whose frequency went higher and lower in a uniform pattern. But then, abruptly, all noise stopped. "Help me!" a voice screamed at me from the radio. My heart sank. This time there was no mistaking the message for my imagination. And even worse, the voice was not that of an old man, but instead of a child, a boy. I don't know what I expected to happen, but for some reason in the panic of the moment I decided to yell out. "Where are you? Are you in trouble?" I stood, still frozen in the doorway, holding my breath and waiting for the radio to give me an answer. Instead, the radio let out a gentle humming noise. As I stood and listened, the hum gradually got louder and louder, switching from a hum to a whine. Before I knew it, a high-pitched squeal was filling the church and rattling every bone inside my head, making me feel like my brain was in a vice. As a final act, the radio sent out a shower of sparks from its corner of the room, briefly illuminating it like the flash of a lightning strike. Thump! I jumped, squeezing my eyes shut and clenching my fists. The noise had come from behind me, near the back door to the cemetery. When I turned around, nothing seemed out of place, but the noise had clearly come from outside. I peeked back into the bedroom. The priest was still there, a scorched radio set in its place on top of the dresser. I decided that the poor old man wouldn't go anywhere and nervously grabbed my flashlight from the kitchen table. As I moved towards the back door, I realized where the noise had come from. On the window was a handprint. It was small, the size of a child's hand. But I had looked out of this window earlier and didn't notice any handprint. It had to be new. When I got to the window, I could see that the handprint was a dirty brown color, almost like whomever hand that made this print had been covered in mud. I felt the hot, moist air hit me as I opened the back door. It had finally quit raining, allowing me to step outside without being drenched. I shined my flashlight down the worn concrete steps and into the cemetery. The headstones certainly didn't look any less ominous than they did from the window earlier. As I stepped down the steps and into the cemetery, I looked at one of the headstones. Michel Levesque had died and been buried here in 1849. How old was this place? There must have been 50 or so headstones in this cemetery, all in similar states of disrepair. Most of them were standing off-kilter and nearly black from decades of Louisiana weather. Keeping this place maintained must not have been part of the deceased's duties. I moved deliberately through the small graveyard, pointing my light behind each of the headstones as I went past. If the priest had been alive, he probably could have heard my heart pound from inside his bedroom. I kept moving until I reached the last row of graves. I stopped. On the back of the headstone nearest to me was another small, muddy handprint. Swoosh. It was the sound of reeds brushing together. I twisted my head over towards the marsh, just a dozen steps or so behind the cemetery. Standing directly in front of head-high reeds was a boy, who couldn't have been older than 8 or 9 years old. I don't know why this sticks out in my memory, but I distinctly remember that he was wearing a scout's uniform, dark blue with the classic shorts and high socks, badges littering his chest. Then I saw his face. His eyes were entirely black. They were so intensely dark that he may not have even had eyes for all I knew. This was a distinct contrast to his face, which was a sickly shade of white, bordering on translucent. On his face there was an unmistakable expression of sadness. The boy's expression soured as he tilted his head. He opened his mouth and I fully expected to hear a foul, ear-piercing scream. Instead, what came out was barely a whisper. "Why won't you help me?" the boy murmured woefully. Then, in a swift motion, he turned and began walking along the edge of the marsh. I stood in stunned silence for what felt like hours. Watching the boy move away from me, I realized that I had to act. Somehow I convinced my legs to overcome whatever fear or inertia that was holding me in place and followed after the child, or ghost, or whatever had just stood in front of me. I followed behind the boy alongside the thicket of reeds that outlined the marsh. He was moving much faster than I expected, and I had to pick up my pace to keep him in my sights. We left the boundary of the church's backyard and into the thick bayou brush. I kept my eyes on the boy as I dodged the vines and fallen trees, but he always seemed to be a fair distance ahead of me. Only when I had reached a small clearing did I lose the boy entirely. I spun around, swinging my flashlight wildly. Somehow I had managed to keep a hold of it in the scramble through the woods. There was nothing. Somehow I had lost the boy and found myself standing in ankle-high mud. I strained my eyes as I looked around, desperate to find a sign of where he had gone. Why would he bring me out here? Was it to kill me? Was this some kind of trap? My heart suddenly picked up its pace. I was desperate to get out of this swamp as quickly as I could. I told myself that as soon as I got back to the church I would jump in my patrol car and get out of this nightmare, dead priest be damned. The coroner could figure it all out in the daylight. Help me. The whisper behind me threw my heart into a frenzy, and I panicked, attempting to turn and back away at the same time, only to fall on my back into the sticky mud I had been standing in. The boy was now a few feet away, still with the look of despair on his face. Unexpectedly, he turned himself to the side and pointed towards the marsh beside him. Help me, he whispered again. I finally knew why I had been brought here. Slowly, I stood myself up, trying to remove the mud off my hands and arms. I stood still for a moment, watching the little boy. He stood firmly like a statue, still pointing into the marsh. I gave him a wide berth as I crept around him, making sure to never face away. When I got a few feet away, I let myself look at where he was pointing, trying to keep him in my field of vision. I searched around in the mud for a moment, unsure of what I was looking for. Then I saw it. A small, circular object stuck partway out of the marsh. I stared at it for a second, my thoughts scrambled. But when I picked it up, I knew exactly what it was. A merit badge. Is this? I started to ask as I turned back to the boy. But the boy was gone. Somehow in the half second I had turned away from him, he had vanished. I turned back to where I had found the merit badge and dropped to my knees, halfway sinking into the muck. And then I started to dig, frantically scooping mud away with my hands. I dug with an urgency that I didn't even know existed in me, and I found myself breathing heavily, realizing that the waterlogged muck was much heavier than I expected. But I knew that I couldn't stop, not until I had found the boy. I finally cleared all of the mud off the boy's body sometime after sunrise. I had thought about bringing him back up to the church, as it seemed like the decent thing to do, but realized that he would have to be photographed and documented by the coroner and crime scene group. I was busy chain-smoking the rest of my cigarettes on the front steps of the church when the coroner finally arrived. Seeing me covered in mud and nervously tapping my foot, the coroner sent me home to shower and take a nap before I was to come to the dispatch office to give my statement to another officer. I gave my statement to the best of my memory, radio, ghost and all. I knew that they would say I was either crazy or lying, and I worried that I may end up on an even worse patrol or potentially fired. But there was no other reasonable explanation for how I had found the boy's body. When the statement was typed up and handed to me to sign, I realized that almost everything about the radio and the boy had been left out. I signed it. No one ever brought it up again. I certainly didn't. Not until now. They solved the boy's case pretty quickly. He had been missing since 1981, and the original investigator had always suspected the boy's father, but had never been able to make a case without a body. Apparently, the marsh, with its thick mud squeezing out any oxygen, had preserved the boy's body so well that there was enough remaining trace evidence to finally convict the father. I think he's still on death row, appeal pending. As for the priest, the coroner determined that he died of natural causes, a heart attack, miles away from any sort of help. The archdiocese had assigned a new priest to the old church within a few days, a fairly young guy too. I felt sorry for him, considering everything that happened there. If it were up to me, I would have had the place torn down. I still don't know why the boy picked me. Why he didn't reach out to the priest still doesn't make sense to me. Maybe he did, for all I know. But I remember that I didn't sleep normally for a week after that horrible night at the church. Every time I turned a corner, my heart raced, expecting him to be standing there, the memory of his desperate face and pointing towards his marshy grave etched into my memory. I visit the marsh every year. Sometimes I bring flowers and place them at the edge of the marsh. I know that the boy isn't physically there anymore, and I hope that whatever part of him that remained and led me to his body has finally left. Maybe that's why I visit, just to reassure myself that he's not still there. I always make sure to bring along a radio.